I caught my son-in-law planning renovations to my house while I was still standing in a grocery store trying to decide which peaches to buy. Nobody asked permission. Nobody called. Nobody seemed to think the owner of the house needed to know. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Living room camera. Motion detected. I opened the app without a second thought. 3 seconds later, I nearly dropped the phone. There he was, standing in the middle of my living room with a measuring tape in his hand, measuring my walls. And standing beside him was his mother. She pointed toward the wall between the living room and the sunroom, talking and gesturing like a contractor surveying a property she already owned. What chilled me wasn't that they had entered my home. It was how comfortable they looked doing it. The terrifying ease of people who had already started treating my house as if it belonged to them. I glanced at the clock. I had been gone exactly 40 minutes. 40 minutes. That was all the time they needed to start deciding which parts of the home I had spent more than 20 years working for should be torn down. Standing frozen in the produce aisle, I felt something inside me finally click into place. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hurt. It was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. And unfortunately for them, I had seen it coming weeks earlier. My name is Martin Holloway. I am 62 years old. I spent 31 years in regional logistics management, and this is the story of how I protected the thing I spent my entire working life building toward, and exactly how I made sure it could never be threatened again. I'll be honest with you before I go any further. When I first started putting this story together, I thought the point of it was the cameras, the recordings, the confrontation. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized the point was actually everything that came before the weeks of quiet watching, the patience that looked from the outside like softness and was actually the opposite. So stay with me through the slow part. The ending earns it. Carol and I bought the lake house in the Blue Ridge foothills outside Flat Rock after I retired. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a dock that extended out over the water and caught the late afternoon light in a way that made you feel like the world had agreed to slow down just for you. We had saved for it over 20 years of careful living. Carol taught dental hygiene at the community college for 22 years. Between the two of us, we had built something real and specific and ours. We drove up on a Saturday morning in October, stood on that porch together, and watched the fog lift off the water. She squeezed my hand. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying. For almost 8 months, the quiet was exactly what it was supposed to be. Our daughter Sophie had married Derek 2 years before this story starts. I want to be precise about Derek, because he deserves a fair description. He was not a bad person in the loud, obvious sense. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't reckless. What Derek was, and I say this with full understanding of how damaging it actually is, was a man who had spent so long working in commercial property development that he had stopped being able to distinguish between a negotiation and a relationship. Everything had an angle, not from malice, simply because it was the only operating lens he had ever bothered to develop. He believed he was solving problems. That sincere belief was the most dangerous thing about him. Sophie taught 3rd grade. She was warm and perceptive, and had inherited Carol's ability to read people clearly, without needing them to explain themselves. They had a son, Ethan, who was 4 years old, and had the kind of laugh that briefly makes all your larger worries seem exaggerated. On a warm Friday in late June, they all came for dinner. I grilled. Carol made the good pasta salad, the one with fresh herbs and lemon zest, not the tired version she makes when she's exhausted. We ate on the porch. Ethan chased something low and flickering through the yard that may or may not have been a firefly. It was exactly the kind of evening that makes you let your guard down. That was, I would later understand, the point. Derek set down his glass, leaned forward with his elbows on the table and said, "So, we wanted to talk to you about something. I have been alive 62 years. I have never once heard a productive sentence begin that way." He folded his hands. Very composed, very attentive, the particular posture of someone about to present you with a solution to a problem you didn't know you had. His parents, Frank and Pamela, had been living in an apartment outside Charlotte since selling their house 18 months earlier. Frank's knees had deteriorated badly. Pamela had been struggling, Derek said with careful neutrality, with the isolation of apartment life. They needed space. They needed quiet. They needed, and here was the word he used, placed with great deliberateness somewhere to land while they got back on their feet. He paused. Let it sit there. Then, just temporarily, maybe 3 or 4 months, His parents could stay at the lake house. The porch went quiet. Carol and I looked at each other. 34 years of marriage is its own language. Her look said, "Let's hear him out." Mine said, "I already see where this ends." We said aloud that we needed to think about it. Derek smiled before Carol finished her sentence. I filed it immediately. 31 years in logistics gave me one genuinely transferable life skill. I notice what people do before they have time to decide what to do. I noticed that smile. I stored it. What followed was what I privately began calling the campaign. Over the next 10 days, Derek texted twice. Sophie called 3 times. Pamela, who had spoken perhaps 40 words to me across 2 years of family gatherings, left a voicemail that ran just under 9 minutes. She described how she had always admired us. She mentioned the lake house with warmth, as though she had been telling people about it. She said 3 separate times that she just needed someone to believe in them right now. Frank sent a handwritten card, which would have impressed me more if I hadn't suspected Pamela had written the draft. Carol softened. I watched it happen across 3 evenings, not because she was naive, but because she is constitutionally generous, and she had not yet seen what I was beginning to see. Derek came by alone one afternoon. He sat at the kitchen table across from me with that composed boardroom posture. He said he sensed some hesitation on my end. "Sharp man," I said. He told me he understood it was our space. And then he said something I want you to hear carefully, because it is the kind of sentence that sounds reasonable until you turn it over and look at the underside. He said that Sophie had been under a lot of stress about the situation, that when Sophie was stressed, it affected their marriage, and that when their marriage was affected, it affected Ethan. I heard every layer of it. He had just held my daughter's peace of mind and my grandson's stability over my head like a conductor's baton, and he had done it with a calm face and a concerned voice, as though he were simply sharing information. I smiled. I told him I'd talk to Carol. He left satisfied. I stood at the window and watched his car move around the bend, and I made a phone call. My former colleague Renee had worked beside me for 11 years in logistics before pivoting into home security consulting when we both retired. She was the sharpest person I had known in 31 years of professional life, which is why she was the only person I called that evening. "I need cameras," I said, "the kind that catch everything, inside and outside, motion activated with audio." There was a pause. Then she said, "Martin, what are you planning?" "Nothing," I said. "I'm documenting." She laughed for a considerable amount of time. Then she told me to give her 3 days. Renee came with her colleague and installed 6 cameras. Front entry, main living area, kitchen, back porch, the foot of the stairs, the driveway, all connected to an app on my phone and back to a cloud server. Motion activated, audio enabled. Legal in our state, I had verified that before calling. I checked twice. I moved our important documents, financial files, Carol's mother's jewelry, and anything irreplaceable into the locked office off the master bedroom. Carol watched me pack a box with an expression balanced between exasperation and genuine curiosity. "You're being paranoid," she said. "Probably," I agreed. I didn't tell her about the cameras. Not yet. I want to be precise about why. It was not deception. Carol and I have never operated that way. It was methodology. If she knew the cameras existed, she would act differently, not dishonestly, just self-consciously. And I needed everyone in that house to behave naturally. I said yes to Derek that evening. Frank and Pamela arrived on a Thursday. Pamela walked through the front door, swept her eyes around the living room and said, "Oh, how charming." The way she stretched the word airy, with a small upward inflection at the end, told me everything I needed to know about the weeks ahead. She touched things as she moved through the rooms. The curtains, the countertops, the picture frames on the hallway wall. Not rudely, almost proprietorially, the way you might move through a space you were beginning to mentally arrange. Frank was quieter. His knees were genuinely deteriorated, and I felt real sympathy for that. He shook my hand firmly, said thank you, and meant it. I could work with Frank. Within 48 hours, Pamela had rearranged the furniture in the living room. I came downstairs on Saturday morning, and the leather armchair I had spent 6 months breaking in the good reading chair, the one positioned at exactly the right angle to catch the morning light off the water, had been shoved into a corner facing a wall. I asked, with exceptional patience, whether she had moved the furniture. She said brightly that the room had terrible flow, and this was so much better. I moved the chair back. She moved it again while I was at the hardware store. We did this 3 times before I made the practical decision to save my energy for what I was already beginning to expect. I want to stop here for a moment and say something directly to anyone watching who has ever had someone casually rearrange their space, their actual, physical, carefully arranged home. There is something specifically disorienting about that experience. It is never about the furniture. It is about the message underneath it. This space is as much mine as it is yours. And once a person starts sending that message, they almost never stop on their own. The cameras were recording everything. In the second week, on a Tuesday morning at 6:15 my hour, the pre-dawn coffee hour I had protected since retiring, my phone buzzed. Kitchen camera. Motion alert. I opened the app. Pamela was at the counter with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in the low, careful register that people use when they believe no one is close enough to hear them clearly. I turned up the audio. I'm telling you, there's so much room here. The 3rd bedroom is just sitting open now that we're in it. But Martin's got that whole locked room off the master that I'm sure is nothing. And he and Carol, they travel. Half the time the house would basically be ours. If we play this right, Stu, I think this could be long-term. I lowered my phone. A heron had landed at the end of the dock. It was standing absolutely still, staring at the water with the patience of something that had decided simply to wait. Long-term. Play it right. I went back inside and made a second cup of coffee. When Pamela came through the kitchen, I said good morning. I asked if Frank needed any of the anti-inflammatory patches I kept for my shoulder. I was so pleasant it should probably have alarmed her. I texted Renee, "You're going to want to hear what I'm collecting." She responded within a minute. "Save everything. I already am," I wrote back. By the 3rd week, the pattern had become clear to anyone paying attention, which is to say, to me. Derek visited often, more often than felt casual. He and Pamela had long conversations on the back porch that they clearly believed were private. The camera at the upper corner of the eave had excellent audio coverage of that entire porch, which I had anticipated when I asked Renee where to place it. What I gathered from those sessions: Pamela believed Carol and I would eventually accept a permanent arrangement. Derek appeared to have told her they just needed more time. Sophie's name came up as Derek's concern, not as someone involved in the plan, which told me that when Derek had held Sophie's marriage over my head in my own kitchen, he had done it without her knowledge or consent. Something cold settled in my chest when I understood that. One evening, I was alone on the dock. Frank came down slowly, carefully because of the knees, and lowered himself into the other chair. We sat without speaking for a while. The water was still. Then he said, without introduction, "I want you to know I didn't ask for this." "I know," I said. "Pamela has ideas," he said. I believe that was the most diplomatically constructed sentence Frank had ever produced in his life. "Derek has ideas too," I said. He looked at the water for a moment. "He gets that from her side." We sat a while longer. Then I asked him directly whether Derek had told him that Carol and I had agreed to this arrangement on a long-term basis. The pause was long enough to be its own answer. He said Derek had told him we were open to it. There it was. We weren't. Frank looked at me. Something moved across his face, not quite shame, more the expression of a man who had suspected an answer for several weeks and was now watching it arrive. "I see," he said quietly. "We didn't discuss it further. We didn't need to." And then came the grocery store. I want to describe that moment precisely, because the feeling of it mattered. I was standing in the produce section. My wife was 2 aisles over. My phone buzzed. And on a 2-inch screen I watched my son-in-law stand in my living room with a tape measure while his mother discussed which walls were load-bearing. My daughter's voice on the recording said she wasn't sure this was fine. It wasn't fine. I stood there holding a bag of peaches, and I felt 5 weeks of documentation click into place like the final tumbler in a lock. Honestly, and I want to be honest with you the way I'd be honest with someone sitting across the table from me, I don't know with certainty that I could have stayed as calm as I did walking back into that house. There is a version of most people, myself included, that wants the volume of the response to match the size of the violation. That wants to roar. But I had spent 5 weeks building something more durable than an outburst. I had built a record. Carol was holding the apples when I told her we needed to go home right now. She read my face and asked no questions. That is 34 years of marriage working exactly the way it should. I pulled into the driveway and saw Derek's car. I went inside. Sophie saw my face first and went pale. Derek turned from the center of the living room, tape measure still in his hand, not yet pocketed, not even the instinct to conceal it. And the professional smoothness came back across his expression like a window shade dropping. "Martin," he said, "a beat. We were just putting some ideas together." "For my house," I said pleasantly. "Well, yes. Down the road, we thought. Why don't we all sit down?" We sat at the kitchen table. I want to describe what that room felt like, because the feeling is part of the story. Pamela with her hands folded, and the particular expression of a woman who has already decided she is the aggrieved party. Derek with the measuring tape coiled on the table in front of him, still not pocketed, still not reading the room with sufficient speed. Sophie staring at her hands. Frank standing in the doorway with the careful stillness of a man who knew what was coming. Carol watching me with the expression she uses when something important is happening and she is deciding whether to step in. I gave her the smallest possible look. She stayed quiet. I said I had something to show everyone. I pulled out my phone. I pulled up the kitchen recording from week 2, Pamela's voice, low and carrying, talking about long-term arrangements, about handling it right, about the house being basically theirs. I let it play to the end. The kitchen went silent. Pamela's face moved through several expressions in quick succession. Derek started. "That's legal," I said. "Single-party consent in this state. Security cameras in my own home. Documented in my property records." "You've been recording us?" Pamela said. "I've been documenting my home," I said, "which I began doing after I was told this was a temporary situation, and then heard you describing it as a long-term opportunity to your son. I want to pause here and say something directly to you. If you have ever been in a room where someone looked you in the eye, said one thing, and meant something completely different, if you have ever sat with the particular disorientation of wondering whether you misread a situation, or whether someone genuinely lied to you, then you understand what those recordings meant, not just to me, to Carol, who had been softened and managed, to Sophie, who had been used as a tool without her knowledge, to Frank, who had been told a version of events that wasn't true. The recordings didn't just expose a plan. They gave everyone in that room the same information at the same time, with no room for anyone to manage the narrative. Sophie looked at Derek. "I have watched my daughter's face at every significant moment of her life. The morning she started school, the day she got married, the afternoon Ethan was born. I had never seen the expression she was wearing at that moment. It was the expression of someone completing very fast mental arithmetic and not liking the result." She said his name once, quietly. It was worse than anything she could have said loudly. She asked if he had told her parents the arrangement was temporary. He said the plan had evolved. She asked whether he had told her that her own stress was affecting their marriage. His jaw tightened. She said, in a voice that was more precise than emotional, "You used me." Not a shout, not a question. A conclusion she had arrived at in real time, in front of all of us, in a voice that had no room for rebuttal. And there was nothing Derek could do, because the person whose emotions he had turned into a lever was sitting 3 feet away from him, and she was too perceptive to need it explained. Then I played the porch recordings. I told them about the key Pamela had taken from the hook by my front door without my knowledge, and copied for her son. I told them what Frank had said on the dock. I told them about standing in my produce aisle watching Derek measure my living room walls. I did not raise my voice once. Not once. Derek tried to manage the room. I watched him work, redirect, reframe, soften, lead with warmth and reasonableness. He was genuinely skilled at it. I will give him that. But there is no pivot that functions when the other person has the audio. You cannot reframe a recording of yourself. Pamela told me she thought I was being very cold. I said, "You sat in my kitchen and described this house as a long-term asset on a call you believed was private. I'd like to be careful with the word cold." Frank, from the doorway, gave the smallest possible nod. Not agreement, acknowledgement. There is a difference. Then I told them they had 2 weeks to make other arrangements. Derek said I couldn't be serious. I told him I had never been more serious about anything that didn't involve a mortgage. Sophie said Dad in that quiet, careful way that meant she was not asking me to stop but preparing herself for what came after. Pamela said this is family. I agreed. I said family also does not walk into a person's home, uninvited with a measuring tape, and discuss the removal of load-bearing walls. That is not family behavior. That is acquisition. The 2 weeks that followed were not peaceful. Derek made 3 separate approaches through Sophie, through Carol, and through an elaborate argument that my refusal to house his parents permanently was effectively a rejection of their marriage, their family unit, their child, and something approaching a moral failure on my part. Carol, by that point, had watched every recording herself, including the porch footage, including the segment where Pamela told Derek that Carol was the softer one, and if you work on her, it'll come around. Carol is many things. Soft is not among them. On day 10, she told Pamela to get out of her kitchen in a tone I have never heard from her in 34 years of marriage, and genuinely hope is never directed at me. Pamela got out of the kitchen. On day 12, Sophie came to find me on the dock alone. We sat together for a long time without speaking. Then she said she hadn't known. About the long-term plan, about what Derek had told me in our kitchen. She needed me to know that. I told her I knew. She asked if I was angry at her. I thought about her at 4 years old running through the yard in the dusk. I thought about her at 17 white knuckling the steering wheel in an empty parking lot, asking me for the 4th time if she was braking hard enough. I thought about the look on her face in that kitchen, the speed of it and the sorrow of it. No, I told her. Not at you. She put her head on my shoulder. We sat there while the light shifted on the water. Dad, she said quietly, I think I need to have some conversations. I think that's a good idea, I said. Moving day came on a Tuesday. My hour. 6:15, coffee on the porch. Frank came down before he left, bag in one hand and held out the other to shake mine. He said he owed me an apology. I told him he didn't. He said he did, that he had suspected the timeline was wrong and had let Pamela manage it because it was easier than arguing, and that was cowardly. I told him he had bad knees and a complicated wife, and he should pick his battles. Something close to a smile crossed his face. Then he left. Pamela walked past me to the car without speaking. She carried the expression of a woman carefully filing a grievance for future reference. I filed one right back, just in case. Derek came last. He stood at the door to the porch with his keys in his hand and said he hoped this didn't have to define them. I looked at him over my coffee cup. I told him, plainly and completely, exactly what he had done. I named every piece of it. Then I said, every conversation on this property is saved permanently. If there is ever another attempt to manage, manipulate, or maneuver this family for your benefit, Sophie receives all of it. Every word. His face changed in a way I hadn't seen before. Not anger, something more accurate than anger. It was the expression of a man who has realized, too late, that he fundamentally misread the person across from him. That the quiet, retired man with the lake house was not slow or soft or easy. He had just been patient. Are we clear? I said. He nodded once. Drive safe, I said. They were gone by noon. Carol came and sat beside me on the porch. She brought the Ethiopian beans, the good bag, the one she saves for significant days, and poured 2 cups. We watched the water. A heron stood at the end of the dock, motionless, waiting. I thought you were being paranoid, Carol said. You were optimistic, I said. There's a difference. She laughed. The real one, the deep, involuntary laugh I have been collecting for 34 years like a man who knows exactly what he has. We sat there until the sun was fully up over the ridge. 6 weeks later, Sophie filed for a separation. I want to be exact about how I feel about that. I don't celebrate it. A marriage ending, even one that needed to end, is not a thing to feel victorious about. My daughter was in pain, and that mattered considerably more than being right. But when she came up to the lake house that first weekend alone, and sat on the porch and let the quiet work on her, and eventually looked over at me and said, Dad, how did you know? I thought about the smile before Carol finished speaking. I thought about the tone of the first sentence. I thought about the measuring tape. I said, I paid attention. And I had a decent camera set up. She shook her head. You were ready the whole time. No, I told her. I just didn't stop watching. Ethan came running down the dock with his arms out, completely certain I was going to catch him. I did. The heron lifted off the water, caught the light, and was gone. Here is what I think about now, when I turn the whole thing over. There is a type of person who looks at a quiet man who has worked hard, built something real, and stepped back to enjoy it, and they see softness. They see someone who will absorb, adjust, accommodate. Someone who moved his own furniture back 3 times without raising his voice. Someone who let things slide rather than make a scene. What they cannot see, because quiet people do not advertise their preparation, is that the patience was never passivity. The patience was the camera in the kitchen corner. The patience was the cloud backup running silently while they made their plans on the back porch. The patience was knowing that the more rope someone uses, the more precisely they define exactly what they were always intending to do. The mistake most people make when they feel their boundaries being tested is that they respond too early before the other person has shown their full hand. What this story taught me, and what I hope it gives you, is this: restraint is not weakness. Documentation is not paranoia. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to someone who has underestimated you is nothing at all. Keep watching, keep saving, let them talk, the receipts will handle it. And here is the question I'd like to leave with you, because I think it's worth sitting with honestly. Is there someone in your life right now who has been slowly rearranging your furniture metaphorically or literally, and counting on you not to notice? That might be worth a moment of your time today. The lake house is quiet again. The chair is back where it belongs. Carol made the good pasta salad last Saturday, and we ate it on the porch while Ethan ran through the yard, and the water caught the last of the evening light. Nobody was measuring anything. Nobody was calling anyone. It was, in every way that actually counts, exactly what retirement was supposed to be. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a 1-inch the comments if you think I handled this exactly right. Drop a 2 if you think I should have confronted them earlier. I've had people tell me they would have said something after the first furniture move, and honestly, I understand that. Drop a 3 if you would have lost your composure before I did no judgment. A measuring tape in my living room is a bold choice. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there. Because this community reaches places I never expect, and I genuinely love knowing where you are. And if you have ever had someone treat your home like it was already partly theirs, tell me about it in the comments. I have a feeling I'm not alone in this. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe. These are the stories I feel most compelled to tell, the ones about ordinary people who protect what they've built in the quietest and most deliberate ways possible. I'll have another one ready for you very soon. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Flat Rock, North Carolina to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.